Usually, of course, he'll hear me on this channel playing a tune or a song of some kind. But because it's Halloween, I thought we'd share a couple of ghost stories. One of them is quite an old story, but the other one is quite an incredible affair. Both are incredible in their way, because they're absolutely true. But the second one actually happened to me. Our first story is quite an ancient one. It took place in the year 1632. It's an old Durham tale called The Miller of Chesterly Street. The miller of the time was just finishing his night's work when he thought he heard somebody crying down in the cellar. He went down to investigate, and sure enough, there was a young girl lying on the floor of the cellar. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" asked the miller. You could see that the young girl's hair was drenched, as if from rain. She did not speak. "I'll ask you again," he said. "What are you doing here?" The girl then raised her head, and the miller could see that it wasn't water that ran down her head. It was blood. Blood from 4 gaping gashes in the back of the skull. No one could live through those wounds. Had she been alive, her brain would have been exposed, possibly leaking out through them. Then the girl began to speak. "I am the ghost of Anne Walker," she said. "My uncle, James Walker, took me in after my parents died. He took my innocence, and I found that I was with child. My uncle said that I could no longer work on his farm, and he sent me away. He said I should go away and live with some relatives 5 miles away along the Durham Road. He would send his friend Mark Sharp to guide us through the night. The road was quiet and dark at that time of night. Mark Sharp kept up a quick pace, so that very soon I was tired, so tired that I could not think straight. I could not keep up with his quick pace. Mark Sharp said that he knew a quicker way. I trusted him. After all, he was my uncle's friend, and I was tired. He led us off the road into the darkness towards an old coal pit. I asked him how much farther we were to go. It was at that point that he took his pick and struck me upon the head. He gave the wounds that you see. He threw my body into the coal pit. His shoes and stockings were covered with my blood, so he threw them in after me, along with the pick." The miller was horrified to hear this story and started backing towards his cellar door. "What do you expect me to do about it?" he asked. "You know my story," the ghost whined as she staggered to her feet and began to glide toward him. "And now you must find my killer and get my revenge." The miller did not sleep easy that night. He was terrified by what he'd seen, but in the morning he laughed it off as a simple case of overwork. He'd let his imagination run wild and probably fallen asleep for a minute or two in the cellar and dreamed the whole thing. That's what he told himself. That is, until Anne Walker visited again that night. This time, she visited him in his bedroom. This time, she wasn't a pleading, innocent girl. She was a vicious, demanding hag of a ghoul. She ripped the sheets from the miller's bed and threatened to tear off his face unless she could get justice. This time the miller was no fool. He begged for mercy and told her that he would obey her commands. The next morning, The miller visited the magistrate and told his story. At first, the magistrate scoffed at the story, as you might imagine. "And you say, Miller Graham, that this was not simply a nightmare, and that you, sir, have not been drinking barley wine?" The miller, truthfully, told the magistrate that it was no nightmare. He also said that he had not been drinking. The magistrate looked into the eyes of this honest man and decided that no harm would be done in investigating. "We'll do our best," he said. A search was made. The coal pit was found. In it, Anne Walker's body lay, along with the pick, the shoes, and the stockings covered with her blood. Farmer James Walker and Mark Sharp were taken to the local assizes and put on trial for murder. The uncle and his evil friend told some terrible, cruel lies. They might have got away with it. They were good talkers. But the judge, the jury, and everyone in court swore that what made up their minds was a shadow on the farmer's back, the phantom of a murdered child. James Walker and Mark Sharp were found guilty of murder, and I'm delighted to say they hung for their crime. Their bodies were buried in the prison courtyard, where they remain in their dishonoured graves to this day. Except by now it's probably been built over and made into a motorway. Except by now it's probably been built over and made into a motorway. Oh, it must drive them mad. Oh, but I almost forgot my own story. This was a Saturday evening in the year 2010. Myself and my good friend Steve and my wife, Hope, were having a pleasant evening. It was just about the time for Steve to go home, and it being a warm night, we all decided to go outside with Steve and wait for his taxi. Now, the flat we lived in at the time was a first-floor flat. It had a wooden balcony with steps up to the flat. There was a flight of concrete steps to get up to the balcony, and a gate down at the bottom to let yourself out, for the flat had its own little shared garden with the downstairs flat. The wooden platform was sheltered by a roof, and there were gaps between the steps. I always said how unsafe it was. Now, Steve was standing out on the wooden balcony, about to go down the last flight of steps and out of the gate because he thought he heard the gate open. Thinking it must be his taxi driver, he waited on the steps for the figure to come forward and introduce himself as a taxi driver. Nobody did. But nonetheless, the heavy footsteps of a man, we can assume it was a man, began to tread through the yard. They walked their way up to the steps and onto the wooden platform. Steve walked towards the figure, asking him his business and asking indeed if he was a taxi driver. There was nobody there, and the steps never went back down. Now, I've described this platform to you, so by now you'll have worked out that there was only one way up and down. Up to the flat, or down back towards the garden and out of the gate. The only other way you could have got down those steps is to throw yourself over the balcony rail, and you would have come to a very nasty end if you'd have done that. The balcony rail was a good 7 or 8 feet off the floor. There was no way you could have landed without at least breaking a leg. But nobody did throw themselves over the rail. There was no scream. And nobody came down those steps. Even to this very day. I explored that platform myself. So did Steve, and so did Hope. None of us were the worse for drink. In fact, Hope was a teetotal. And there were no hallucinogenics involved. So what's your explanation? You might have found one for the Anne Walker story. Perhaps you've pooh-poohed the whole idea and said that Miller Graham had been seeing a girl and invented the story after he'd killed her himself. But how do you explain a man walking up onto a balcony and never coming down, and managing to hide himself on a platform roughly 3 feet across? Still not believing in ghosts? Good night out there, whatever you are.